Welcome to the Michiana Hivecast, where wellness meets community and conscious living takes flight. I'm your host, Jamila Blue, and I am so glad you're here. This is your space to expand, evolve, and grow together. Each episode, we celebrate the heart of Michiana through real conversations with local practitioners, healers, creatives, and community builders who are lighting the way towards connection, balance, and transformation. Whether you're just beginning your journey or deep in your practice, you'll find inspiration, insight, and a sense of belonging right here in the Hive. At Conscious Michiana, we are all about uniting people, sharing resources, and co-creating a thriving, holistic community. So let's get buzzing, and thank you for being a part of this conscious collective. The Michiana Hivecast, buzzing with wellness, connection, and conscious living in Michiana. Expand, evolve, grow. Welcome to our special Grief Awareness Week conversation. Today, we're honored to speak with Patti Shaffner, a grief tender, certified grief educator, and passionate advocate for grief literacy. Patti's journey began in 2019 after the sudden loss of her husband, David, which led her to discover firsthand how inadequate grief support can be in our culture. Since then, she has dedicated herself to creating spaces where grief is honored, not rushed or silenced. Patti believes that grief is not something to fix or get over. It is an evidence of love, and our tears are holy. Today, we'll explore her story, her work, and how we can all become more grief literate and compassionate in supporting one another through life's inevitable losses. You've been doing some work, haven't you?
I've been doing a lot of deep and hard work for the last 6+ years. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Let's get right into it, Patti. Can you share what the first days were like after your husband's passing, what it felt like for you?
It felt like I had no space for anything or anyone. My basket was full. Um, it was difficult. I did not cry really for 4 days.
Mm,
Um, and then it was a particular situation that kind of drove me against the wall. I was surrounded by my sons and my grandchildren within the first 24 hours. But there is a surrealness. I did a lot of writing after David died. Um, the head knew, the logic knew, and the heart could not register. It was as though the connection between those two could not be made. On an intellectual level, I knew that he was gone, but my heart could not begin to understand what that meant. And so it was shattering, it was crushing.
mm, mhm. I can't even imagine. Patty, what is the most surprising thing that you discovered about grief during your own experience?
That it does not somehow dissolve, that it does not end. It is a continuing thread that moves through you. Um, I didn't know that before then. My experiences with grief had been that my mother was the kind of person who, once someone died, they were buried or they were cremated, and then you wiped your hands clean and you didn't speak of them again.
Mm,
And that's a very different experience. It's what I grew up with. It's how when my mom died, when my dad died, and I was there in the room with them when my friends died. It says so, okay, they're gone. And yes, you can feel sad about it, but it needn't really interfere with your life, right? Your life goes on. I didn't understand how grief can impact you in ways that you can't begin to imagine until you're there. People ask about secondary losses. They asked me within the first month, do you know your secondary losses? Well, yeah, let's see. And my husband's income is now not there. Um, there's somebody missing from my bed. There's, all of these practical things. Yes, I can say those are secondary losses, but it wasn't until months later when the light bulb went out in my bedroom and I'm short. My husband was 6'2". I stood on a step ladder and I was still too short to take care of the light bulb. And I'm suddenly standing there crying. And I went, oh, well, who knew? Or you're
Mm,
standing at the grocery store and you're standing in front of something that was your beloved's favorite food, but it's not yours. And you're standing there thinking, I should buy this, but why? It's not something I like. And find yourself crying in the grocery store. Um, yeah, those sorts of things. Hearing some song or driving past someplace months or years later and suddenly being overwhelmed with a sense of loss. Yeah, like that. Many things more as well, but
mm, mm. You have said grief support sucks in our culture. What made you feel so strongly about this?
so at the time, I had a friend who has since died, who's a therapist and a very good friend. She was someone who had been so supportive of me even the night that David died. She called me from the airport to talk to me. She was on her way to California. And I said, can you be my therapist through this? And she said, no, because I'm too close to the situation. I feel like I won't have enough therapeutic difference. Um, so she said, find someone. I looked around. I was recommended to a woman who, well, she lost her brother. She knows grief. David and I came, and I come from a very deep spiritual place. A lot of meditation, a lot of deeper ways of engaging with life. And at the end of 3 sessions, her suggestion for coping was that I make a quilt or a teddy bear out of his t-shirts. And what I said was, that's all you got out of me out of 3 hours? That's what you got? And I was done. So I went looking for further support. And the same friend said, why don't you try a Jungian therapist? And we suddenly were in shut down from COVID. Anything that I did had to be done online. I managed to. There is a Jungian online. I didn't know there was such a thing, but I found them and did find someone who was in Canada. I was able to work with her a bit, and she was helpful, but the focus was on dream work and not so much on grief work. It was helpful to me because I do have a deeper spiritual and some psychological background. So I was able to put pieces together. But it wasn't until I started finding people like David Kessler, who I eventually went on to study with, that I found that there were people who were saying, no, you don't have to get over this. No, grief does not end in 6 months or a year. Um, I had actually searched online because at 6 months, I still felt this tremendous sense of pain and loss. And I could find articles that said, if in 6 months or a year you're still not feeling better, maybe you should, get some medication or, you should seek a therapist. But I couldn't find a therapist. So David Kessler started during COVID doing an online Facebook call twice a day live, and it was a place where people could write out what it was that they were experiencing. Um, and out of that came his grief educator course, which I decided in 2021 to enter. And I learned a lot about my own grief, and I learned a lot about being present for other people who were grieving. Um, because our stories are and our griefs are all unique. Each person's grief is unique to them. And there are parallels, but your grief is the worst for you. My grief is the worst for me. We can't compare them, but we can walk side by side.
Hmm. Why do you think our culture struggles so much with supporting grief?
There is a historical perspective to this, which I read in Hope Edelman's book, The After Grief, Navigating the Long Arc of Loss. And in there, she talks about prior to World War I, uh, there was actually a book for women that told you how you should dress, how long you should grieve someone. It was different if it was a second cousin as compared to a child, but a widow was expected to show the outward signs of mourning. Mourning is different from grief in that mourning is the external expression of our grief, and the grief that we feel is an internal experience. And so women were expected to mourn their husband in an outwardly public way for 2 years. And now we get 6 months
Mm.
or a year, perhaps. So when World War I happened, suddenly bodies were there in Europe, and they weren't brought home. There was no way to have formal war mourning for that. And we were in this grand world, global experience that said we have to put our energy into the war effort. We can't put our time and effort into grieving. We don't have time to do that. And so that then got extended into World War II, and since then, where someone goes off to another country, their bones can't even be brought home to be honored. So I believe that's part of it. And then, of course, we have our rugged individualism that our country and our culture says, John Wayne and all of those guys who stood for, I can do it myself and I don't need anything else outside of myself. And we have this rugged individualist perspective in America that says we don't need anybody else to help us and we can muscle through it, we can power through it. That's in the past.
Mhm.
So I think those things have deeply affected how we view ourselves. We're supposed to pull ourselves up from the bootstraps and keep moving forward. In fact,
Mhm.
if anything, one of the things I heard so many times that it made me just want to scream was, "You're so strong." No, I'm not. No, I'm not. What does that mean? I'm supposed to be strong. What am I supposed to be strong? Because I'm still breathing, because I'm still putting on my clothes and feeding myself, because I'm still
Mhm.
paying bills? That makes me strong. You have no idea because you're not watching me fall apart on my living room floor, howling at the ceiling.
Mhm.
You can't see that. That's what I'm doing.
How do societal expectations like moving on or getting over it impact people who are grieving?
It makes you shut down. It makes you not tell people what you're going through. I have a friend who's recently a widow, and she says, "Oh, I just smile. I just smile because otherwise people want to know, how are you doing? But they don't really want to know. They don't really want to know. They want you to say, I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine."
Because that allows them to feel better and move on.
Allows them to feel better. That
Uh-huh.
allows them to say, well, I've asked.
Uh-huh.
I've put the effort out. And I don't mean that in a way that sounds like everyone on the outside of the immediate grief experience is not sensitive to it. It's just that
Mhm.
we're so disconnected from the experience of allowing ourselves to feel that we don't know how to engage. We don't know how to be present. We don't know that sometimes what someone needs is just for us to sit with us and be quiet while we feel.
Mm.
Does that make sense? Let me clarify. Because we are so unaccustomed to sitting with our emotions with someone, we distance ourselves. And we distance ourselves with words, and we distance ourselves physically. One of the things that you'll hear in grief support that is much better is that your address book changes after
Mm.
someone. People that you thought were going to be there for you are nowhere to be seen. They're dealing with their own relationship to grief, and they don't have a good language around it, which is why I call myself a literacy advocate for grief, because we need better language. We need ways in which to engage with one another that are authentic, that are more grounded, um, that are less fearful, like that.
Mm. What myths about grief do you wish we could collectively dismantle?
The first one would be that grief ends, that it has a termination date. It doesn't have a termination date. It shifts, it changes, it softens, layers peel away and allow us to continue to live forward. And we will always miss the person who is no longer physically present in our world.
Mm.
That's probably the number one. Um, that we need to be fixed. We need platitudes, that we need, don't be sad that he's gone, be happy that he lived. I personally tremendously dislike the grief is just love with no place to go. Pardon me, but BS. Grief, our love has somewhere to go. It does not end because it is not being able to be directly expressed to a physical person. That love has everywhere to go, and it continues on in a continuing bond with the person who has died. So to say that it has nowhere to go, that minimizes the grief, that minimizes the love. Let's not do that. Let's not minimize our grief or our love by saying it's just this or just that.
I love that. Mm. As you've mentioned, you've trained with David Kessler and you've also trained with Francis Weller. What key lessons from them have shaped your approach?
Well, to David Kessler, I think I spoke to this briefly earlier. We don't compare griefs. Yours is the worst. Um, to say that child loss is the worst is to minimize my grief. Why? I don't, it is the worst for you. Yours is the worst. Um, that's a really important one that I learned from Kessler. Also, if I can tell a little story from David Kessler, he spoke of being on tour in Australia. And in Australia, he met a researcher who had been spending time with the northern indigenous folks there in Australia. And according to the researcher, the night that someone dies in the community, Everyone sets something, a piece of furniture or something outside into their lawn so that the next morning when the bereaved family wakes up, they look outside and they see that everything has changed, not just for them, but for everyone in the community.
Mm,
And they take loss and make it visible, and they witness one another in this way to say, we understand. We understand that there is loss, and this loss is tremendous, and it affects and changes everything, including us. And our funerals don't do that most of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time. Um, yeah, it's important to make it visible. From Francis Weller, what I learned is that Uh, there are five gates of grief. The first is everything you love, you will lose. The second is there are those places in yourself that you had to reject to survive in the world. And those places that have never known love get outcast from us, and we grieve those. The third is the sorrows of the world, and certainly we live in times right now. It could be ecological loss. It can be loss of species and songbirds, insects, the loss of our water. It can be political loss. It can be all of the sorrows of the world, the loss of community, war. The fourth gate is the things that we expected when we came into this world at a time when people lived in closer villages. The birth of a child was celebrated because that child had a gift or gifts that were going to be given to the community. And now we have to prove our worth um, just for existing. And the fifth gate is the gate of ancestral grief. And this can be anything from how you've lost touch with ritual and traditions to the generational traumas, addictions, and so forth that show up in our lives because of generational traumas, um, because of generational experiences. So there's five gates, and those five gates are important to recognize because typically when we talk about grief, we're talking about the loss of a person or a pet. Also, through that program, I learned a lot about the ambiguous griefs, um, the unacceptable losses, the disenfranchised griefs, estrangement, you know, divorce. Well, you've signed the divorce papers, kind of like my mother's approach to grief. Um, yeah, it's hard to find someone who can stay with us in those that are not culturally acceptable griefs.
mm, mhm. Can you explain what a grief ritual tender does and why ritual matters in grief work?
Oh, yes. So, a grief tender is someone who is willing to be with you and be with grief and not be frightened of it and not be overwhelmed by it and to hold the container that allows for other people to express their grief and to not lose my center if I'm going to be with someone. I did a grief retreat this past weekend. My main job is to be there and provide a safe space where it's safe for you to say how you're feeling, whatever it may be. Maybe it's anger, maybe it's guilt, maybe it's confusion, maybe it's several people said, I don't know who I am anymore. To be able to allow uh, them to say what they need to say, to hear it, and to recognize it as true. Um, and the ritual part of it, of uh, actually going to an altar where we put mementos, where there are representations of those and what we love that we've lost, um, and to in our ceremony we take salt and put it into water to recognize that this is our tears, and we give those tears back to the land, to allow it to be taken to the ocean that is the mother of us all. Um, Sometimes rituals can be taking a stone and putting um, our intentions of our love into those and to give that back to the earth, to bury that and say, I give you this part of my grief. I know that it's not taking my grief away, but I'm honoring it and I'm honoring my loved one in doing this. Um, Legacy work. How can you continue to honor and speak of your beloved and honor who they are and who they were? Because they cannot do it physically anymore, but the things that they left behind, perhaps it was something as simple as my mother was an extremely generous person. And no matter what other kinds of difficulties I had with her, she was a generous person. And I honor that. And I hope that I am as generous in my life. And that's legacy work.
Hmm. You said grief is love and our tears are holy. Can you unpack this for us?
That comes from Martine Prechtel, um, who wrote a book called The Smell of Rain on Dust on Grief and Praise. And Martine, um, he says, when we experience grief and we are crying for what we have lost, but we are crying for what we have loved. And it is in praise to the creator or the universal divine, by whatever name you choose to call that. We are giving our praise back with our tears. I loved this. I loved this person. I loved this land. I loved uh, uh, this animal that was my companion. I am praising that which is holy with my tears. I am saying, I miss this so much, and thank you for the gift of that. So my tears in my grief are holy because they are praising what I love.
How can we learn to see grief as sacred rather than something to be fixed?
Ooh, how? That's an excellent question that I don't know that I have an answer for. Um, if I think about it off the top of my head, I'm going to go back to Martine and to David Kessler's experience with the Australian researcher, that we can be more in community, that we can actually begin to acknowledge as a culture that grief is not something that has an endpoint and that it does not need to be fixed or healed. I dislike the word healed in relationship to grief because if I break a bone, yes, my bone will heal. Um, but grief is something that is metabolized and integrated rather than healed. Um, and that's my perspective. I'm not the only one that shares that, but that's my personal experience. I want to be intentional with my language. And that's what I'm asking from our culture right now, is to be intentional. In fact, if anything, if we can take a sacred pause before we respond to someone, what is our default? Sorry for your loss. I'm so sorry for your loss. Oh, that's terrible. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And you end up with a list as long as both your arms and beyond of people saying, I'm sorry, because that's the default. And it does not mean that just to take that little phrase, I'm sorry for your loss. So if I may, use my acting skills. I'm sorry for your loss. Sorry for your loss. Or I'm so sorry for your loss. There's a difference there. And the difference is that I took a pause and I couldn't think of anything else to say, but I'm sorry for your loss. But I wanted it to come from a place of my heart being open to the fact that someone is sorrowing right now, that they are in pain. If we take that sacred pause and ask ourselves, if it were me in this moment, what could someone say to me that would feel of comfort? We're more likely to approach things from a more authentic place. Our hearts open in that moment. And most of the time, what we do is we want to push it away. We want to get away from that experience because it either reminds us of our loss in the past, or it reminds us that there's going to be that loss because that loss is going to be there for you at some point in time. So we want to escape from it. But if we can stay present with it, if we can stay present with one another, it may not be that words are even necessary. One of the most profound experiences I had within the first few weeks of David's death was someone that I knew seeing me in a restaurant. I was getting up to leave, and she said, I was waiting until you were going to leave. I didn't want to come over before. I don't have anything that I can say. May I hug you? She asked permission. She knew she didn't have words, but she wanted to acknowledge that I was there in front of her and that I was in tremendous pain. What a difference for that experience than somebody coming up and saying, oh, I heard about David. It's so terrible. What happened? And I have a couple of fingers, one on each hand, that I give to people as a salute in that. Because that's not the way to approach someone who is in grief. A sacred pause. And that in and of itself, that makes that connection to the holy. Yes, that feeling.
I love that. Thank you. How can workplaces become more grief literate and supportive?
Ooh, that's an excellent one. And I don't know that I have an answer. There are some organizations out there that are beginning to provide some information about approaching grief in the workplace. One, I was retired, fortunately, when David died. I was a dental hygienist by trade, and had I been forced into going back to work and trying to function, I cannot guarantee what kind of experiences my patients would have had because I had sharp little instruments in my hand.
Mhm.
And I was far too distracted to be able to do that. I might have been able to see a patient or two a day, perhaps. But to expect someone to come back to work fully functioning after the typical 3 to 5 day leave that they are given. And sometimes you can be given as much as a week, I guess, or maybe 2 weeks, but that's the typical loss, expected time off of work. And it's insane and absurd to believe that then someone's going to be back online 100%. So lightening their workload, allowing them time to perhaps say, I'm not functioning well right now, I need to leave. And that might be difficult for the employer. And yet, are we a commodity being sold as someone who's working, or are we a human being who is providing a skill and a service? So asking employers to look at it perhaps from that perspective. And I can certainly, when we are done with this, go back and look at my resources and find the ones that might be the best for how to address grief in the workplace. But those are the
Thank you.
immediate things I can think of.
Yeah, that would be very helpful. When we do the page for this episode, I would love to have some of those resource links. What changes would you love to see in our society and how our society approaches grief in the next decade?
I would like us to stop using platitudes. I would like us to stop, again, I'm reiterating this, but I think it's an important part, to stop thinking of grief as something that ends. Um, and to recognize that changing the ways in which we hold space for one another when we're grieving, that, after the funeral or after the memorial, we all just expect that, someone's going to go back to normal when normal isn't there any longer. I had a friend in the the second year, but the second holiday season, asked me how I was doing, and I said, not well. And she said, well, some people bounce back faster than others. And it took me about 24 hours to come back and say, what is it that you want me to bounce back to? Because nothing that I knew as my solid ground is there any longer. So what do you want me to bounce back to? She said, well, apparently I need to be more careful about how I talk to you. How about less careful than more mindful? There's a difference. So expecting someone to be normal or to be over something isn't unreal is it's an unrealistic expectation. Invite them out. They may say no 10 times, but invite them 11. Show up. Show up. And it may be simple as, like, especially in the first couple of years, take their garbage out if you live near. Go shovel their walks. Ask if they need food. Do you need food? I've made a big bowl of a big pot of soup. May I bring you some? Asking permission, um, not just assuming. I didn't eat. Food showed up on my doorstep. I didn't even know what it was. I didn't know who it was from. It just showed up on my doorstep, and I wasn't eating. So asking permission. Um, yeah, asking permission and being present, showing up. Even if it's years later, even if it's somebody just signed divorce papers a couple months ago, reaching out and saying, how's today? How's today? Then how are you? How is today? How is this moment for you?
Mm-hmm.
And not assuming that someone knows exactly what they want, because you can ask, you can say, what do you need? I don't know. I don't know what I need. I need my husband back. I need my child back. I need not to be feeling this, and yet here I am feeling it. When we show up for people, we allow, and we don't have the expectation of they're supposed to be in a certain state of mind or state of being. We can show up for them in a way that allows them to be exactly where they are in this moment. And if that means tears, that means tears. And we don't try to hand them the tissue so that they can quit crying right now. That, if they say, would it sound crazy if I put my husband's urn on his side of the bed and sleep with it in bed? No, doesn't sound crazy at all. Sounds normal to me. It's the new normal.
If you could leave listeners with one message about grief, what would it be?
That it is not something to be afraid of. That it is not something to cure. That it exists in all of us. And as Martine Prichtel says, all war is unmetabolized grief. If we recognize that you're grieving, I'm grieving, and it doesn't have to be this thing that stops your life. It's something that you learn to integrate into your being in a way that allows you to continue to say yes to life. Because when someone dies, often, or if we're experiencing profound grief, often what we tend to do is want to say, no, I don't want this. I don't want this. I don't want this. And yet I'm still breathing. And so my breath, every breath is another yes to life. So how can I continue to say yes to life?
That's beautiful. Is there anything else that you would like to say or mention that you've not done so already?
Look for those resources, be they another person, be they nature, be they a book, be they a movie, be they journaling, that support you in where you are in this particular moment. There are lots of resources out there, and if there's something that came from COVID that is a positive, it is that there is far more grief support out there now than there was, and a lot of it is really good. And reach out. Don't be afraid to reach out, even if you don't know how. We have to stumble into our lives sometimes, and if we fall down a few times in that process, that's okay. We'll find our way off the floor again, and we'll find that which supports us the most. So my approach may not be what is going to work for everyone. So look for and find those resources, however small or however large, that continue to support your being able to say yes to life.
Beautiful. Thank you, Patti, for your wisdom. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for the awareness and the literacy that you bring.
Thank you.
That is a wrap on today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us in the Hive. We hope you're walking away inspired, energized, and ready to expand, evolve, and grow on your own journey. If this conversation moved you, sparked a new idea, or made you feel more connected, share it with a friend and help us keep the buzz alive. Conscious Michiana is a nonprofit powered by community, and your support helps us keep creating meaningful content, hosting events, and connecting people to the resources they need to thrive. Visit consciousmichiana.org/donate to contribute, because every drop of honey helps. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and stay connected with us on social media. Until next time, be well, Michiana. The Michiana Hivecast, buzzing with wellness, connection, and conscious living in Michiana. Expand, evolve, grow.